I didn't know his name at first, only the aftermath, because in this world you don't meet legends directly, you meet the damage they leave behind, the quiet kind, the kind Vought can't spin, the kind that leaks into police radios as confused whispers about a man who wouldn't stay down. And my first encounter with him came through a body cam recovered from a private security team sent to erase a mistake buried under a forest of non-disclosure agreements. The footage shaky and claustrophobic, the men laughing at first, calling him short, calling him old, calling him not a Supe, until the laughter broke into coughing, into screaming, into a silence so heavy it felt intentional, and then the figure stepped into view. Hunched slightly, shoulders wide, beard matted with blood that wasn't staying where it should, eyes reflecting the green glow of night vision like an animal caught mid-hunt, and when the bullets hit him they sounded wrong, dull thuds instead of impacts, as if the world itself refused to acknowledge the violence. And he moved forward anyway, slow, relentless, each step measured, each breath fogging the lens. And I remember thinking before the camera fell that this wasn't how superheroes fought. There was no posing, no speech, no branding, just survival distilled into motion. And when the claws came out, they weren't announced with music or lightning. They slid free with a sound like truth scraping bone. And the feed ended not with a scream but with a whimper. And that was when Vought knew they had a problem that couldn't be managed with PR, because whatever had crossed into our universe didn't care about being seen. And fear, real fear, doesn't perform. By morning the narrative was already rewritten to risk intrusion. Foreign tech, lab malfunction, but inside Vought Tower the air felt thinner, like a pressure drop before a storm. Executives speaking in rehearsed tones while their hands trembled under the table. And I sat in the back of the room transcribing, watching Homelander watch the footage, his smile fixed, eyes unblinking, and there was something wrong with that smile, something stretched, because Homelander understood optics better than anyone alive. But this wasn't an optics problem, this was a mirror, and mirrors scare people who spend their lives pretending. And when the analysts explained regeneration rates, skeletal density beyond known composites, pain response that didn't register like a Supes, Homelander finally spoke, voice calm, almost curious, and asked a simple question that froze the room. Does he want something? And no one had an answer, because desire is how you control gods, and this thing on the screen didn't move like it wanted anything at all. Logan felt them long before they found him, because he'd been hunted across worse landscapes than this one, and cities full of smiling monsters didn't impress him. He moved through alleyways and back roads, keeping his head down, healing faster than he liked, every regeneration a reminder that time refused to take him. And when the boys finally crossed his path, it wasn't destiny. It was coincidence sharpened by paranoia, Butcher recognizing a fellow Redditor the way soldiers do, Huey staring like he was looking at a comic book that bled, Mother's Milk calculating angles that didn't exist, and Logan listening, really listening, because he'd learned the hard way that loud men were rarely the most dangerous. And when they talked about Homelander, his jaw tightened just enough to notice, not from fear but from memory, because every universe had its tyrant wearing a hero's face, and when Butcher offered him purpose, revenge dressed as justice, Logan shook his head, because he'd spent lifetimes letting rage steer him, and all it ever did was leave more ghosts walking beside him. The night Black Noir came for him. It rained, because it always rains when the world wants to pretend something is normal, and the fight happened in close quarters, not a spectacle but a collision. Noir moving with rehearsed precision, blades finding arteries that closed before blood could teach them anything. Logan absorbing punishment with a grim patience that unnerved even me watching the slowed footage later. Because pain meant something to him, but it didn't define him. And when Noir finally faltered, stunned by a body that refused to fail, Logan stopped, claws hovering, breathing heavy, choosing restraint in a world that rewarded excess. And that choice rippled outward in ways no one predicted. Because mercy is destabilizing when your entire system runs on fear. Homelander couldn't let that stand, not really, because gods need witnesses, and Logan refused to look. Impressed, and when they met it wasn't announced, no cameras, no crowds, just ice and wind and distance, and the impact of their clash didn't crack mountains, it cracked assumptions. Homelander hitting harder than anything Logan had faced in years, and Logan enduring, standing back up again and again, not defiant, just stubborn, like the concept of surrender offended him. And for the first time since his powers manifested, Homelander felt resistance that wasn't scripted, wasn't terrified, wasn't asking for approval, and something ugly surfaced behind his eyes, something human and small. And when the lake broke and swallowed them both, the silence afterward felt sacred, like the world holding its breath. Logan walked away from that encounter carrying new scars that healed too fast to matter. leaving behind a god who had tasted vulnerability and didn't know how to metabolize it, and the world didn't end, it just shifted, subtly, the way rot spreads under paint. And now when I listen to Vought briefings, when I watch Homelander smile for crowds, I hear the tremor beneath it. The knowledge that somewhere out there is a man who doesn't need to win, doesn't need to be loved, doesn't need to be feared. And that knowledge is corrosive, because systems like ours don't collapse when confronted by bigger monsters. They collapse when confronted by something that reminds them what they aren't. And Logan keeps moving. Because stopping would mean remembering. And remembering would mean admitting that no matter the universe, the fight never really ends. After that night, the world didn't react the way it does when cities burn or planes fall from the sky, because fear like this doesn't scream, it whispers, and it seeps into places where confidence used to live. And I started noticing it in the small things first, the way Vought security drills doubled without explanation. The way analysts stopped using the word unstoppable when talking about Homelander. The way Maeve drank more and spoke less. Because once you've seen a god hesitate, you can never unsee it. And Logan felt that shift too, felt the invisible eyes tracking him through borrowed phones and compromised satellites. But he didn't change his pace, because slowing down was how they cornered you. And speed was for men who still believed in endings. And instead he drifted through the underbelly of the country. Places where Supes didn't pose for cameras. Where Compound V leaked into the bloodstream of desperate people who never made it onto posters. And he saw what this world really looked like beneath the polished broken families. Burned out neighborhoods, children who flinched at the sound of capes snapping in the wind, and something old and heavy settled into his chest, not rage, but recognition. The boys crossed his path again, not because they planned to, but because Vought did, because pressure creates convergence. And I listened later to Huey's voice shaking as he described watching Logan dismantle a soup safe house run by a B-list hero who live-streamed charity while running human trafficking through the back door. And Logan didn't announce himself, didn't threaten, didn't lecture, he just ended it quietly, efficiently, leaving behind a mess no marketing team could sanitize. And Butcher watched it all with a smile that never quite formed. Because he saw the problem immediately. Logan wasn't angry enough, wasn't cruel enough, wasn't willing to become what this war demanded. And that made him unpredictable, which made him dangerous in a way Butcher didn't know how to control. Homelander, meanwhile, spiraled in private, because public gods don't get to process trauma, they just rebrand it. And the nightmares started soon after the lake. Dreams where his punches landed and nothing happened. Dreams where his heat vision carved scars that closed again and again. Dreams where a man who wouldn't kneel stood behind him during speeches, silent, watching. Under psychologists, Vought assigned used words like stress response and ego destabilization, careful never to say fear out loud. And when Homelander finally snapped at one of them, vaporizing him mid-session, the room went quiet, not with shock, but with relief, because violence made sense again, and sense was comforting. Logan knew the hunt had shifted when they stopped sending killers and started sending messengers, fixers, intermediaries, men with smiles like contracts offering isolation, off-world relocation, silent sport with resources he didn't want. And Logan declined them all the same way, by leaving them unconscious but alive, because he understood the message beneath the offer. Disappear or we'll make you disappear, and he'd buried too many friends to be moved by threats dressed as mercy. The breaking point came in a town that barely existed on maps. A place Vought had written off after a failed soup trial left half the population sterilized and the other half dependent. And Logan arrived there chasing a rumor about a man who could burn buildings with his mind but couldn't remember his own name. And what he found instead was a massacre already in progress, Homelander hovering above the streets like a judgment rendered late, his voice echoing through loudspeakers, calling it a lesson, calling it justice, and the people below scattering like insects. And Logan felt something crack inside him, not rage, but responsibility, because walking away was easy, and he was tired of easy. They clashed again, this time witnessed, not by cameras, but by people, and that changed everything, because gods behave differently when mortals are watching. And Homelander smiled for the crowd even as he attacked, narrating his own righteousness, while Logan said nothing, absorbing blows meant to make examples, standing back up each time with blood steaming off his skin. And the crowd watched as the myth fractured in real time, watched a man who didn't fly refuse to stay down, watched a god struggle, watched power fail to inspire obedience, and fear shifted direction like a tide. Homelander won that fight, eventually, because raw force still matters. And Logan lay broken in a crater that should have killed him, bones snapping back into place with wet sounds. No one forgot, and Homelander left him there on purpose. Because killing him would have been mercy, and mercy was weakness. But the damage was done. because the footage leaked anyway, shaky phone recordings spreading faster than Vought could contain. And for the first time, children saw their hero bleed without a script. Logan healed alone that night, staring at unfamiliar stars, wondering when endurance had turned into obligation, wondering if survival was just another kind of curse. And when the boys found him days later, they didn't ask him to fight anymore, they asked him to stay. Because symbols don't need to win, they just need to exist. And Logan didn't answer right away, because he knew how stories like this ended. Knew the cost of standing between monsters and the people they called collateral. And somewhere high above, Homelander watched the world react to doubt for the first time in his life. And he smiled wider, and shook, and began planning how to remind everyone exactly what happens when gods feel threatened. The days after the town burned, blurred together into something heavier than aftermath, because aftermath implies an ending, and what followed was escalation. Quiet at first, then unmistakable. The way predators adjust when prey stops running, and I tracked it through fragments, internal memos labeled public reassurance, emergency edits to school curricula emphasizing trust in heroes, a sudden spike in disappearances that never made the news, and Logan felt it in his bones, because his bones remembered patterns, remembered how empires tightened their grip when myths crack, and he moved with the patience of someone who knew the longer game, sleeping under bridges and in shuttered motels, healing in silence, listening to the hum of a country that had learned to accept fear as infrastructure. And when he did step in, it was never where cameras waited. It was in basements and back rooms, in places where the screams didn't echo far enough to be monetized. And people started talking about a man with knives who didn't ask for thanks. And that scared Vought more than anything, because gratitude is currency, and he wasn't collecting. Homelander went on tour because denial needs applause, and every appearance was louder than the last. Every speech sharpened into a warning dressed as inspiration, and I watched the footage frame by frame, noticing the tells, the way his eyes scanned crowds for threats that didn't exist, the way his jaw tightened when chance lagged, the way he hovered a little lower than before, closer to the people, as if proximity could restore faith. And behind him, billboards rose overnight depicting him larger than life, slogans promising safety through obedience, and the psychologists called it narrative reinforcement, while the lawyers called it necessity, and the soldiers called it orders, because someone always has to enforce belief. Logan crossed paths with Starlight by accident, or what passes for accident in a world where everything is tracked, and she didn't recognize him at first. Not really, because he didn't look like a savior. He looked like a man who'd been losing for a very long time and learned to keep going anyway. And when she did recognize him, when the rumors aligned with the scars, something in her expression softened and hardened at the same time, because she understood the trap of symbols better than most. And they talked quietly, about limits, about lines that once crossed never uncross, about the cost of standing still while the world tells you to smile. And Logan listened, because listening was how you honored people who were still trying. And when she asked him why he stayed, why he didn't leave this universe the way he'd arrived, he told her the truth, which was that running never fixed anything. It just changed who paid the price. The boys weren't unified anymore. Not really, because wars fracture people along fault lines they didn't know they had. And Butcher pushed harder, angrier, convinced that Logan's restraint was a luxury they couldn't afford, while Huey watched footage of towns that looked like home and started losing sleep. And Mother S. Milk tried to keep them operational while knowing deep down that operational was just another word for bleeding slower. And Logan saw all of it and said nothing, because leadership was something he'd sworn off after too many graves, and still they followed him, not because he commanded them, but because he refused to lie about what this would cost. The next confrontation wasn't explosive, it was surgical. Vought deploying a narrative purge disguised as disaster response. Supes sweeping through low-income districts under the guise of protection, relocating people who asked too many questions. And Logan stepped into that machine like a wrench thrown into gears, disrupting patrols, breaking chains quietly, leaving behind proof hard drives, testimony, faces people could point to, and every act of interference forced Homelander to respond. And every response peeled away a layer of control. Because domination works best when it's invisible, and Logan made it seen. Homelander finally confronted him not with fists, but with words, broadcasting a message directly into hijacked screens across the country, calling Logan a parasite, an invader, a relic of a violent past that needed to be put down for the greater good. And Logan watched it from a pawnshop television with the sound turned off, reading lips that promised salvation through annihilation. And something settled in him, a clarity that didn't feel like hope but wasn't despair either, because he'd heard this speech in 1,000 variations, always from men who mistook power for purpose. They met again in the ruins of a stadium abandoned after a chemical spill Vought never admitted to, and the fight there wasn't about who hit harder, it was about endurance versus spectacle. Logan forcing Homelander to chase him through corridors full of echoes, forcing him to confront a battle without an audience, without applause to feed on, and Homelander grew sloppy, angrier, his blows heavier but less precise, while Logan absorbed and redirected, not winning but surviving long enough to make a point. And when Homelander finally pinned him, screaming about gratitude and loyalty and what the world owed him, Logan laughed, a raw, broken sound, and told him that being feared wasn't the same as being needed, and that was the moment Homelander lost control completely. The stadium collapsed around them, not from the fight but from neglect, because systems rot when all the resources go to image, and Logan was buried under concrete and rebar and dust, while Homelander tore free and fled because staying would have meant facing what he'd become without witnesses to validate it, and Logan lay there healing slowly, deliberately, listening to the creak of a structure finally, giving in to gravity, and thought about how many worlds end, not with explosions but with neglect. When he emerged days later, dragging himself into the light, the world was different again, not safer, not better, but awake, and the whispers had turned into conversations, and the conversations into questions. And Vought responded the only way it knew, how by tightening the fist and calling it a hug. And Logan understood then that this wasn't about killing a god, it was about outlasting a system, and systems hate patience, because patience exposes lies. I don't know how this ends, because stories like this don't end cleanly, they fray, they fade, they scar. But I know this: somewhere out there a man who refuses to stay down keeps walking through a world that finally noticed it could bleed. And that knowledge, once learned, can't be unlearned, and gods who know they can fall never fly the same way again. The fallout didn't arrive like thunder, it arrived like paperwork, like curfews and checkpoints and smiling announcements about temporary safety measures, and I watched the country fold in on itself one regulation at a time while Logan moved through the cracks they couldn't seal. Because cracks are born from pressure, and pressure was all Vought knew how to apply, and every time they tightened control, another seam split somewhere else, another quiet act of defiance bloomed where cameras didn't reach, and Logan became less a man and more a rumor, less a rumor and more a presence, something people whispered about in shelters and basements, a shape in the dark that meant someone else was finally afraid instead of them. He didn't seek it, didn't want it, but symbols don't need consent, they just need witnesses, and witnesses were multiplying. Homelander felt it slipping, not the power, he still had that, but the meaning. And meaning is the thing that keeps monsters convinced they're heroes, and without it every reflection becomes an accusation. And he started appearing unannounced, hovering over towns without schedules, demanding gratitude like a tax. And when applause faltered, he punished the silence. Not with massacres this time, but with precision. Disappearances framed as relocations, families erased so cleanly even grief didn't know where to land. And the psychologists warned him privately that fear without admiration curdles into resistance. But Homelander had never been good at listening when he was scared. Logan crossed paths with one of those erased families by accident, a mother and two kids hiding in a drainage culvert beneath a highway overpass, shaking not because they were cold but because they had learned the sound of boots and capes and engines meant. They were about to lose something else, and Logan sat with them in the dark until their breathing slowed. Gave them food he'd stolen without guilt. Directions he knew wouldn't be safe forever, but would be safe tonight. And when the youngest asked if he was a superhero, Logan hesitated. Because lies were easy and truth was heavy, and he finally said no, just a man who doesn't quit. And the kid nodded like that made sense, like quitting was the real villain all along. The boy splintered further after that, not violently, just quietly, because exhaustion pulls people apart the way gravity pulls rubble downhill, and Huey wanted out. Wanted something that didn't feel like living on borrowed time, and Mother's Milk understood but stayed anyway, because some debts aren't payable with survival. And Butcher burned hotter than ever, convinced that Logan's refusal to finish it was prolonging the suffering, and Logan listened, took the anger without flinching because anger was familiar territory, and he knew that if he crossed that final line, if he killed Homelander, he wouldn't just end a tyrant, he'd crown a martyr, and martyrdom is how systems regenerate. Vought made its move not with Homelander but with replacements, rolling out a new initiative, a new team, younger, cleaner, eager to please, marketed as the future of heroism. And the subtext was clear: gods are interchangeable, loyalty is not. And Logan watched the announcement from a cracked tablet, seeing the cycle reset in real time, and something inside him hardened, because he'd seen this trick too many times, the way evil survives by changing faces while keeping the same teeth. The confrontation that followed wasn't planned, not by Logan, not by Vought, not even by Homelander. It happened because inevitability doesn't need coordination, and it unfolded in a refugee processing center hastily built inside an old sports complex, chain link fences and floodlights and armed guards calling it safety while counting bodies. And when Logan stepped in, it was to stop a beating already in progress, a guard enjoying his authority too much, and when the guard raised his weapon, Logan broke it, and when the alarms sounded, Homelander arrived like a storm that had been waiting all day. This time there were no speeches, no hovering, no performance, just impact. Homelander driving Logan through walls, through fences, through the thin fiction of order Vought had erected, and Logan fighting back not to win but to slow him, to draw him away from the people cowering behind plastic barriers, and the fight carved scars into the building that would never be repaired because no one repairs places meant to be temporary. And in the chaos something remarkable happened. The crowd didn't run, not all of them. Some watched, some filmed, some screamed, some prayed, and some stood, because once you see a god struggle up close, once you smell the blood and dust, and fear worship loses its grip. Homelander noticed them watching, really watching, and his control fractured completely, rage spilling out unchecked, heat vision cutting too close, too sloppy, and Logan seized the moment not with a killing blow but with a choice, throwing himself between Homelander and the crowd, taking the full force of it, burning, breaking, healing slower this time because damage stacks even when death doesn't come, and he screamed then, not from pain but from effort, from the sheer weight of refusing to move, and the sound echoed through the structure like a verdict. Security forces flooded in, orders scrambled, cameras everywhere, and Vought lost the narrative in real time, because no script accounts for a man bleeding on purpose so strangers can live, and Homelander, faced with that image reflected back at him from 1,000 shaking phones, hesitated, just long enough for the moment to crystallize, and then he fled, because staying would have meant answering a question he could no longer silence. What if he wasn't needed anymore? Logan collapsed after body finally demanding payment, and as medics who didn't know who he was worked to stabilize someone they deep and told was a threat, I realized something fundamental had shifted, something no press release could reverse, because power had blinked first, and endurance had been seen, and that's all it ever takes to start the end of a myth. The recovery took longer than Logan liked, not because his body failed him but because the world kept intruding. Because once you become an idea, people start leaning on you in ways that bruise deeper than bone, and he woke in a half-abandoned clinic run by volunteers who didn't ask questions, their hands steady, their eyes tired in the way of people who decided that doing something small was better than doing nothing at all. And as his wounds closed, and the pain retreated into its familiar background hum, news drifted in through cracked radios and whispered conversations, footage of the refugee center looping endlessly. Slowed, analyzed, argued over, commentators debating whether what they'd seen was bravery or terrorism, whether standing between a god and civilians counted as heroism if the man doing it didn't wear a cape, and Logan listened without comment because public opinion was just another weather pattern, loud and unpredictable and rarely fair. Homelander didn't appear for days after that, and the absence spoke louder than any appearance ever had, because gods are supposed to be constant, supposed to reassure by existing, and his silence allowed something dangerous to grow: speculation, doubt, memory, and Vought scrambled to fill the void with press conferences and substitute faces, rolling out the new team ahead of schedule, saturating feeds with carefully curated rescues and staged humility. But the comments kept circling back to the same image, the same moment, the same man refusing to move, and no amount of distraction could unsee it. Logan left the clinic before dawn, because staying invited attachment, and attachment was how you got people killed. And he moved again through back roads and freight lines, feeling the weight of eyes that didn't feel hostile anymore, just hopeful, and that hope scared him more than Homelander ever had, because hope demands answers, demands commitment, demands a future, and Logan had learned the hard way that futures are where expectations go to die. Still, he intervened when he had to, couldn't stop himself, because some instincts are older than fear, and each small act added to the myth he was trying to outrun. The boys found him less often now, not because they stopped looking, but because their paths diverged. Kui disappearing into anonymity with a kind of relief that tasted like guilt, Mother's Milk staying in the shadows, coordinating, documenting, preparing for a reckoning he knew wouldn't be clean, and Butcher burning through contacts and patients alike, convinced that the only real ending involved blood. And Logan felt the pull of that anger every time he imagined Homelander rising again, because men like that don't accept lessons, they retaliate against them. When Homelander finally returned, it wasn't in public, it was in private, appearing in Logan's path like a memory you can't shake, hovering low over an empty stretch of desert highway at sunset, the sky painted red like it was already warning them, and there was no crowd, no cameras, no one to impress, just two figures standing at opposite ends of a long, cracked road, and the quiet between them felt heavier than any fight they'd had before. Homelander spoke first, voice stripped of theatrics, asking why Logan wouldn't just finish it, why he kept choosing endurance over victory, and Logan answered honestly, because honesty costs nothing when you're already tired, telling him that killing him wouldn't fix the world he'd helped build, it would just give it an excuse to stay the same. That answer enraged Homelander more than any insult ever could, because it denied him the dignity of being the final problem, and the fight that followed was brutal and fast and personal. Not about spectacle or message, just two forces colliding again and again, each impact sending shockwaves through the empty land, and Logan pushed himself past what felt safe, past what felt survivable, because sometimes survival demands excess, and Homelander matched him blow for blow until exhaustion crept in, not physical but existential, the slow realization that no matter how hard he hit, this man would not validate him by breaking. The fight ended not with a kill, but with collapse, Homelander landing hard on the asphalt, stunned, staring up at a sky that didn't care who he was, and Logan standing over him, claws out, trembling, every instinct screaming to end it, to stop the cycle, to carve certainty out of chaos. And he didn't, because endings like that feel good and fix nothing, and he turned away instead, leaving Homelander alive and humiliated and alone, and that choice echoed louder than any explosion ever could. The aftermath rippled outward faster than before, because this time Vought couldn't spin absence or denial. Homelander's authority eroded quietly as replacements stepped forward, as corporate structures adjusted, as power redistributed without ever being relinquished, and Logan watched it happen from afar, recognizing the pattern with a kind of weary clarity. Tyrants fall, systems adapt, and the work continues whether you're there to see it or not. He kept moving, because movement was his only certainty, and the world adjusted around him, sometimes kinder, sometimes crueler, but always changed. And when people asked if the age of gods was over, no one answered, because ages don't end cleanly. They bleed into one another, and somewhere in that bleed, a man with claws and scars and too much memory kept walking, not as a hero, not as a weapon, but as proof that endurance, once witnessed, can never be forgotten. What followed didn't feel like an ending, it felt like weather settling after a long storm, the kind that leaves the ground softer but unstable, and I tracked it the only way anyone could through absence, through what stopped happening as much as through what still did, because Homelander didn't vanish, he was quietly sidelined, his appearances rationed, his authority diluted through committees and strategic realignments, a god reduced to a liability managed behind closed doors, and that demotion rippled outward in subtle ways, Supes hesitating where they once acted with impunity, crowds clapping out of habit rather than devotion, Vought slogans growing longer and more defensive, because when belief cracks it doesn't shatter all at once, it sheds flakes, and those flakes get everywhere. Logan stayed out of sight during this, deliberately, because he understood something. Vought never had that pressure without a focal point collapses inward, and by refusing to be present, refusing to posture as the alternative,